Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Crosswires. It's James here. You're listening to the Variety Tech Podcast. That's how I'm going to describe the show from now on, where we talk about all sorts of interesting topics and things that maybe have a positive impact on technology. So I'm not quite sure why I've invited my guest this week. I was waiting for that reaction. No, my guest this week has been someone I've known for far too long. I think he'd agree, and who has an amazing insight into sort of programming or coding, if you want to use that term, as well as contributing to and I guess leading an open source project. But folks, please welcome to the show Joel Drapper. Joel, how you doing?
Thanks very much, James. Good to be here.
Good to have you. I still have to count it, but I think we're coming close to the 15 years that we've known each other, which is...
Yeah, that sounds about right.
How has that happened? I mean...
Yeah, I had no idea.
So, Joel, tell people a little bit about yourself. What do you do right now? What's your your primary focus at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm a software engineer, primarily doing like web development. So I don't do anything native at the moment. I'm kind of interested in exploring that space. But currently working with a small startup that do search engine optimization technology. So they kind of analyze your content and competitors and give you kind of like insights on how you can improve. In my free time, I also maintain a number of like free open source software libraries for the Ruby programming language. Yeah, so that takes up a lot of my time now as well.
Also, and you're a podcaster as well. You and your co-host Colin do now. Is it Rooftop Ruby? Is that the show?
Yeah, that's the one.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we started that I think something like 3 months ago. I might have that wrong. I'm terrible with dates. Yeah, it's pretty new podcast. It's I would say it's not exactly a general tech podcast. It's very specifically designed for like experienced Ruby developers who kind of just want to hear a couple of other engineers like talk about various questions and issues and design patterns and things in that space. So it's very niche.
So it's inside baseball for Ruby devs, basically. It's a lot of insight. Yeah. Okay. Which, you never know. We might have some Ruby devs listening to this episode. So do go and check it out. But Joel, the first thing I wanted to ask you about is because you've been programming for a very long time. Literally, as long as I've known. In fact, it's how we met. I hired Joel. I'm not sure if did I ever pay you?
Yeah, you paid.
Okay, I paid. That's good. I paid Joel to do some development work for me for a very old WordPress site, and somehow we became friends through that process. But Joel, I mean, your journey, you are entirely self-taught, right? You don't have any formal qualifications in the computer science or development space.
No, I mean, I pretty much don't have any formal qualifications in any space. So,
okay. Did you have? I mean, sorry to you. Did you end? Because I mean, I hope you don't mind. You were homeschooled, right? So, yeah. Did you get any British certified English maths?
I think I have English and maths, like GCSE equivalent. But beyond that, I haven't really done anything.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, look, without trying to really really exaggerate here, Joel really has done well to say that he does not have a degree or a master's or anything like that. You've worked for some big names in tech, and we won't name them, mostly because we don't want to give them any promo, right? Not so much about who you've worked for, but just we don't want to promote that particular company. But I remember you getting headhunted for a huge company. I'm like, what? So, yeah. Do you want to tell people a little bit about how you got started and what got you interested in coding in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned I've been programming for a long time. I haven't. It depends on what you call programming. So if you count like HTML, CSS, and like a few occasional copy paste sprinkles of JavaScript, then I've been programming for quite a while. So like since I was probably, I don't know, like 14 years old, something like that. But I basically started out, I was really, really bored one day, and I was like pestering my parents, like, what should I do? I'm so bored. And my dad said, well, why don't you build a website? And this must have been when I was like 10 or 11, actually. So it kind of depends where you say it started. But I think, so me and my brothers and sisters had this game where we were like special agents. And so the first website that I made was basically, it was like this portal that you could go into to find information like profiles on people and like what crimes they had committed and things and like what they were suspected of. So I basically coded this up, and it had the coolest thing to me was making an authentication system for it. Like this idea that I could build something that you could log into and have like special secret access to this information that no one else could access.
So I've got to stop you there. Knowing both of our passions for security, I want to know. I want to know what this was built on.
Right. So this was HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the password was hard coded in the HTML page in a bit of JavaScript I had copied and pasted. So it wasn't exactly secure, but it worked for the game.
Fair play. So no passkeys, no 2FA.
No. Yeah, so that's kind of where I started, and I really enjoyed the fact that, you know, with nothing, a laptop and a bit of time, you could basically make anything happen, and it was so cool. So from there, I kind of started kind of just gradually doing more and more stuff. I met some friends who are about the same age who were doing similar things, and we started a little company. And I got kind of more and more into front-end development and design and user experience, and kind of did that for quite a while. And then I eventually ended up getting a job when I was 17 at a website development marketing agency. And so I worked there for a few years as a front-end developer, and then kind of gradually over time, like, got deeper and deeper into that. And then eventually ended up working in an agency where I was kind of a partner in the agency. You know the story here.
I'm trying not to laugh. I'm really trying not to laugh at this point, because this is a time that me and Joel actually worked together.
Yeah,
like, Joel was my boss for all of 6 months.
Oh, I have no idea.
It was bad. Anyway, that maybe is a story for another time. But Joel, sorry, carry on. My apologies.
Yeah, so up to this point, I've been basically entirely front end, entirely like markup and accessibility and style and design, like everything in the front end, but nothing kind of that I would really call actual programming. Not really programming any kind of logic or anything like that. Just hadn't been exposed to it really. Anyway, so we're working on this project, and the deadline is looming, and the front end side of the project was like really on track. Like everything was done. Back end, not so much, like it was falling behind. And so I just decided like, well, I'll see if I can help out. And so the back end was Ruby on Rails, and I just kind of went on the Ruby on Rails guides and figured out roughly what I was doing and kind of started contributing. Got a lot of help from other people, but basically was just trying to get this one project over the hill, if that makes sense. And I loved it so much when I realized when I realized a few basic concepts, I just enjoyed it so much that I wanted to carry on doing that.
And you did, and I think you went on you went on to do a bit more sort of freelancing stuff, and then
yeah. So I was freelancing then for I think a couple of years after that, and then ended up going to work for Shopify for a few years.
You actually moved over. You had to move over to Canada, didn't you? Like that was.
I did. I had to do a few. I had to tell them that I had been programming for more years than I actually had. At this point, it was like 1.5 or something, 2 years. And then, but like interview went really well. They took me out to Canada and actually moved the whole family out there. And that was great. Eventually got the chance to move back to the UK And in fact, then COVID happened and everyone was working remotely from that point on. So I was already remote at that point. Didn't really make any difference to me.
Didn't they end up closing their offices, Joel, in the end?
Yeah, I think they did.
Like a lot of companies will have done, to be fair. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they've reopened them again now, but then I got laid off. And that is when I basically, there are a few things that I wanted to do. Like when you're programming, you end up kind of noticing areas of like the code that just seem to come up again and again that just don't feel quite right. They feel like really awkward. And one of the areas for this for me, especially like given my background in doing front end, was like the way that you kind of build, the way that like the front end of a web application interacts with the back end of a web application was just really, really awkward. And I wanted to really solve that problem and basically take a lot of the experience I had doing the back end and kind of bring it into some new front end tooling. Anyway, so when I got laid off, I had some severance pay and I had a few months kind of margin, I guess. And so I spent like 7 months just working full time on open source software, building this library. Yeah, that was really fun. And then eventually ended up getting the job where I'm at now. So that's kind of, I've been programming, I think, for like 6-7 years in total, all in.
So you would, I mean, and it's an interesting point you've raised, because I guess I would have always seen people who code, maybe coding versus programming is an interesting one, because, you can say you're a front-end, if you're a front-end developer, you are potentially working in JavaScript, HTML, CSS, but I think that, JavaScript you could definitely say is programming. It's like HTML is just describing, it is using code, but it's really just like wrapping specific bits of text or images, that kind of thing, in markup that describes what that thing is. And then CSS is basically saying, like, for all of these specific things that I'm going to select, this is how I want them to look, and some very basic behavior, I think, as well in CSS. But in JavaScript, you actually get into logic, like there are conditional things. There's like classes and objects and all the things that you'd find in a normal programming language in JavaScript. I just didn't really do much of that kind of JavaScript before. No, you were very heavily, because we were going back to that team of youngsters. You were focused on the front end side, whereas others did the PHP stuff.
Right.
Because you guys did a lot of WordPress work, which is how I found you to do the WordPress site.
Yeah, we did a bit of WordPress. We did a bit of Python and Django, but like I never learned Python, and I at the time I couldn't even tell you what a class is. I didn't understand classes until like 6 years ago when I started Ruby.
So let's, because one of the things, that I will really give Joel credit for, Joel is very keen on helping people learn.
Yeah.
And Joel, look, anyone who knows me knows. So I was working as officially my title was company secretary, but I was basically doing the day-to-day admin of a business, trying to run customer support and trying to manage the people side of a team. Joel's face, Joel's just smiling because we obviously can't share exactly what happened to that company, but I can edit this out if you want. But I will say this, when you've got a managing director who's trying to put his Primark trainers as company expenses, that's what I had to deal with.
That wasn't me, by the way.
No, that was not Joel. That was definitely not. No, you were good. You were Thanks. Honestly, just for the record, Joel was completely innocent in any wrongdoing. But Joel got me, we were doing was it like a hack weekend where we actually went up to the client's office for like a whole weekend?
I can't remember.
It was a big project, and we went up and we stayed in London. And obviously I was there to make sure that no one was being idiots with the company debit cards and trying to manage things. But Joel said, well, why are you here? Why don't you actually learn some Ruby? So you got me on Treehouse. You encouraged me to get on Treehouse, which I'd used before for front-end stuff, and actually start trying to learn Ruby. Now, this is kind of where I want, before we talk about some of the open source stuff, because that's really cool. We've talked so much with people like Tom Lawrence and Nick from a Linux Experiment, and of course, Josh from Nextcloud about how important open source is. But before we go down that route, Joel, if people are wanting to learn now this is a back-end programming language, isn't it, in terms of Ruby?
Yeah.
Now, can you, in as simple a terms as possible, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, when we say front end and back end,
sure,
at a very simple level, what do we mean by those two terms?
Okay, so basically, we mean code that is executing on a server. That's back end code.
Okay.
And code that is executing in your browser, that's front end code.
Gotcha.
So usually the back end code is doing things like authentication, connecting to a database, doing a lot of like domain specific logic for that application. And then it's sending quite plain data back to the front end, which is then rendering in your browser what you see on the screen. And like, so for example, like the style of a button, that's front end code.
Okay.
Maybe like an animation that happens when you click a button, that's front end code.
Gotcha.
But what actually happens when you submit a form, that's usually back end code.
Is that why, Joel, then? So if it's been rendered at a browser level, is that why, for example, between different browsers? And I always remember when I transitioned to the Mac, because me and you transitioned after I did to the Mac. But I always remember moving to a Mac, whereas Windows was very, very boring buttons, whereas Mac OS would have nice fancy ones. And that's because the browser's interpreting the instructions in the front end code, the HTML, the CSS, differently.
Yeah, so if you render a button on a web page and you don't specifically style it, like you don't say, I want to take control of exactly how this button looks, then the browser is responsible for styling that button. And on macOS, they use like the native button look, and on Windows, they use the native button look for Windows. And so they look quite different. You can, of course, like take control and style buttons exactly how you want them, like, and they'll probably look exactly the same on Windows or Mac, or pretty close.
And again, just to be clear, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are all running browser side.
Yep.
Or client side.
Yeah, you can run JavaScript. You can run JavaScript on the server and use it for your backend as well, but it's not the same runtime.
Got you.
You've got like something running in your browser that's then connecting to something running on a server.
Okay. Whereas Ruby, would PHP be server side?
Yeah.
Okay. So Ruby, PHP, you're going to hate me for this. I know. Well, no, because you used to deal with stuff. ASP.NET was
Yeah,
that was all.
Yeah, you can run a lot of this stuff on the client now if you want to.
Okay.
But I mean, usually it doesn't make sense to run Ruby on the client. Like you can technically run Ruby through this thing called WebAssembly, which basically allows you to use any programming language that supports WebAssembly. You can use that for the things that happen in the browser. But typically, for the kinds of applications that I build, that just doesn't make any sense. Like the front end stuff is very basic and it's very focused on just styling and layout, and then everything else happens in the back end.
That's really cool. All right. So for someone wanting to start off, let's because you are a back-end developer, are a developer, let's start with sort of if someone came up to you right now and said, Joel, I want to learn how to code, I want to learn how to program, where do you point them to? What language, what set of resources, and what maybe top 3 tips would you maybe give for someone starting out?
Yeah. So I'm pretty biased because I love Ruby and I think it's amazing. I would definitely recommend. I think like Ruby is a very complicated language, but it's also quite easy to read and understand what it's doing. Like it is incredibly complicated and it's also incredibly simple depending on kind of how you look at it. But I think that I would recommend Ruby as a really good place to start. Yeah, so I would grab a book called Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. Read that and see if you enjoy it. You don't even have to like start writing and executing the code. I think this book is so accessible that you could pretty much just read through it and have a good idea of like, does this way of thinking about systems like really work with my brain? Like, do I enjoy this kind of thing? And, you know, if you do, then start experimenting, like try and use all of the examples in that book and get them running, and then like tweak them and make your own stuff. Another book that's really excellent, I'd say, is a book called Grokking Algorithms. And this is basically, it sounds pretty intimidating, but this uses like cartoons and like really cool like hand drawings to explain how some algorithms work, and it kind of makes them really accessible. Like, I've actually been over like a bunch of these algorithms with my 9-year-old boy, and we like he is able to grasp a lot of this stuff. It's like so well described and explained. I think it makes it really accessible. So that's another good one to start out with, I think.
And what about because as I mentioned, you pointed me in the direction of Treehouse.
Right.
What about online learning portals? Because let's be really clear, there are so many course providers out there, online course providers, and not all are created equal. Do you have any go-to because everyone has a different learning style, right?
Yeah, I don't have a go-to because it's not really my learning style.
Okay.
And I've not really been asked that question recently either, so I haven't done any recent research in the area. I know that, I'd recommended Treehouse to you. I don't know if Treehouse is even a thing anymore.
I think it is. Let me have a look. I think they are still a thing. I was going to say, I'm not sure. Do you know what? I'll try. Okay, folks, what I will do is I will try and find some that look half decent. I'll run them by you, Joel, before this episode goes out.
Okay. Yeah, if you get on well with books, like there are a ton of books on Ruby, and I'd encourage you to try to build something simple using Ruby and Rails, and like follow a tutorial, because what you really don't want to do is like try to work on something that's so complicated you don't get any success. I think the reason that Ruby on Rails is so good for beginners is you can follow a tutorial and like build your own blog or something in a few hours, and like it will work locally, you know, so you get that real sense of achievement. Like, I've built something and it's so cool, it actually works. And then you can kind of just go from there. Well, what if I add another field? What if I try to add some logic so that, this is required or something? You know, you can kind of just like build an experiment. I highly recommend doing that if you're interested.
And with Ruby, of course, you can install this on your own machine to do it. You don't need server.
You don't need any servers.
No, you can do this. And if you're on a Mac, are we still recommending Homebrew these days?
Yeah, I mean, I would use Brew to install a Ruby version manager, like RBENV, and then you can use RBENV to install a specific version of Ruby. So, like, install the latest one.
And of course,
and then kind of go from there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Of course, I've just realised we should also, because I know we're big fans of these. I know you don't have one anymore, but we've previously been big fans of these Raspberry Pis. If you can get a hold of a Raspberry Pi, maybe the 400, if you have maybe a Windows PC that you don't want to use for coding, you don't want to, because it's a bit harder to get Ruby up and running on Windows, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't think it's that hard.
No?
I think now they have. Don't Windows have like a kind of Linux virtual
the subsystem
thing on it now? Subsystem?
You're right.
Yeah.
The Linux subsystem. Actually, I take that back. But that said, the Raspberry Pi 400, if you can get one, is a great little computer if you want a little dev environment, right? I mean, it's a brilliant little computer. Anyway.
Honestly, if you want to do development, get a Mac. Even if you like get a secondhand Mac, the software and all of the great software engineering software, like the apps that we use to make apps, the best stuff is on Mac, like by far. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend.
And certainly, look, we're both on Apple Silicon Macs now.
Yeah,
I mean, and we've both journeyed through that Intel era of Macs, right? Just as a completely aside, has the transition to Apple Silicon, have you found it sped up your workflows and sped up?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, so much better.
Okay. Just because it's faster and...
Yeah, literally everything is significantly faster. And
the power draw is ridiculously small.
Yeah, like it's crazy. My Mac like lasts all day. That was unheard of on Intel.
Oh gosh,
like
yeah.
I would get maybe 2-3 hours at most if I wasn't really doing anything on my Intel Mac. And now my laptop runs literally all day, no problem. And I've got the first MacBook Pro that they put an M1 in, the 13-inch 2020.
And it's still running good?
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Just for sort of like nerds, bear in mind, I'm running, obviously running video, Squadcast for video streaming. I've got a bunch of other apps up. My Mac Mini is only drawing about 24 watts of power to do all of this right now. Mm-hmm. It's insane. It really is. So we'll put some resources. Treehouse does still exist, and they do still have a lot of Ruby courses, so we'll put a link in there. Of course, we have no affiliates to any of these, and we don't have an Amazon affiliate, so we put all the books into the show notes. But, Joel, thank you for that, because I hope people will get something there. I mean, I guess the biggest question is, obviously, I think you do, but you enjoy solving these challenges, right? And is that maybe the biggest draw for you, is using code, using your knowledge of languages to solve a problem that, or make things easier for people? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, to me, like, it's just so much fun. So programming languages, and particularly Ruby, it's just like, it is like learning a new language. It's a way to express ideas and concepts. And there are like these specific abstractions like classes and objects and method calls. And when you learn how they kind of fit together, you realize that you can express any logic in this very clear, pure language of logic. And it's just so fun to use when you really get into it. And, part of the fun is like figuring out what kinds of concepts do I want to build in this world. Like you're trying to model some specific domain problem, and you need to try to break that down into small components, small objects that represent things, and that's part of the fun. Like how do I break this problem down into the smallest things that I can make really, really easy to understand, and give everything names that are going to like make sense and ring true, and you come back and you try to read it and try to understand it. Like when you start programming, you often end up like writing, big walls of text, or like really deeply nested, if conditions. So like if this, and if this, and if this, and if that, like, and you get a bit more experienced, you learn different ways of like completely avoiding that. Using techniques like polymorphism, or I don't know, just all sorts of different like techniques that you can use to write your code in a clearer way that kind of expresses that logic in a really nice, simple way. That's what I really enjoy about it. Like it's just so much fun.
So Joel, you mentioned that obviously one of the things you've been working on is these open source projects. Now, tell us a little bit about what that's like, because this is effectively code that and tooling that you're building, libraries you're building to make things easier, to have you might need to help me understand this concept here.
Right. Yeah. So, when you write software, you typically will, this is tricky to explain. So, there are a lot of specific problems that we try to solve that are actually like 99% generic problems, not specific problems. So an example might be rendering a navigation item on a web page. That's a very specific problem. Mm-hmm. But the generic problem is like just rendering something on a web page. And so what we try to do when building a library is like try to identify some of these like abstract patterns that we can use, mm-hmm. so that when you want to do something specific, you can say, well, I'm going to implement this abstract thing. And you get like 90% of what you're trying to accomplish from the library that is shared. So you've got a lot of shared code. And then you can just implement the specific details about how you're using that thing, if that makes any sense at all.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, yeah. But so basically, I'm thinking of a good, now, again, feel free to yell at me. It's almost like a template, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's not so much a template, because a template might, if you think about like a recipe, a recipe tells you how to do something, but every time you use the recipe, you have to
adjust
do all of those steps again.
Oh, okay.
But imagine if you could just say, I want to use that bread recipe and I want to tweak it by just adding one thing. I just want to add some raisins into my bread, right? And you don't have to do all of the steps of that recipe. This is a silly analogy, right? But imagine you just push one button and you get the bread recipe, and you get to just chuck in your extra addition to it. And now you have a specific implementation of bread that is like bread with raisins. But you didn't have to, figure out how to make bread from scratch.
Well, I guess
it's silly, really silly analogy.
No, it makes a lot of sense, because your recipe is a step by step. You have to do this, and this. Whereas, I mean, and this is me coming from a design background and a PowerPoint and Keynote builder. A Keynote template, for example, defines most stuff, and then you might tweak a little bit, but you've not had to go and lay out all the background.
Right.
In fact, here's even better examples. When I do, and I say when, it is a case of when, not if. When I do YouTube covers, the what do we call the thumbnails? YouTube thumbnails.
Yeah.
I've got a template in Affinity Designer that's got all the little bits to lay out where I want my gradient, where I want where this layer is going to be. I just then have to drop in the extra little bits that I want for that particular video. Is that maybe a better analogy?
Yeah, that's a pretty good analogy. So you might have a template, and the two things that you customize are the thumbnail and maybe a text field, right?
Yeah, exactly that, yeah.
But you don't have to recreate the whole thing from scratch every time. And that's kind of what you get to do when you build a software library. It's just, a bit more abstract than that.
Okay. And so these are solving problems that either generic problems or problem specific to a language, in this case, Ruby. Now, your two libraries, now I'm going to remember the name of one and forget the name of the other. One is Flex,
Lex.
Lex, Flex.
Yeah, PHLEX.
So what does Flex very, very simply give people?
Right. So traditionally, when you're building a web application, you want to render some views to the browser. This is basically the kind of translation layer between backend and frontend.
Gotcha. Okay.
So you've got your backend system running. You then want to have some HTML that you can send to the browser that's then going to allow the browser to download the CSS and the JavaScript and then render something that people can look at and interact with. So typically what you would do is you would write a template file, and this template file would be written in kind of like a special language that is able to jump between HTML, which is the language for the front end, and say Ruby, which is the language for the back end. Or this could be PHP, it could be anything. So PHP is kind of like this by default. Every PHP file is kind of like, actually, I don't know if this might be different since I last used PHP. In PHP, when I used it, every PHP file was basically an HTML template that had bits of PHP scattered throughout it. But in Ruby world, there's this language called ERB, and basically it's HTML, except you get to say, well, this bit specifically is Ruby. So you might have HTML would define a list, and then you'd have a bit of Ruby that says for each item, and you come out of Ruby, and then you define in HTML again, list item tag. And then you go back into Ruby and you render the content of that list item. Anyway, so websites or web applications would be made up of like these template files, and they're typically very, very big, sometimes thousands of lines long, and they're very complex because there's so much nesting. Like you might go into a list of articles, and then for each article, you want to list, comments, and then for each comment, you want to list the username, and then for each username, you want to list, I don't know what you can just, you can go on forever. Anyway, so what my library does is it tries to really simplify this by saying, let's think about everything on the page as an object. So you might have like this the list of articles is an object, the individual article is an object, the list of comments is an object, the individual comment is an object. And the idea is that you define these things, these classes of things in pure Ruby, and then you can create one of these objects. So you can create a new instance of a class of object. So you might say, like, I want to create a new article, and then you give it the parameters, that it requires to be an article. So maybe it's got a title and some content, and these could be other components too, right? At the end of the day. And then you're able to render that object into HTML. So you kind of have this abstraction layer that lets you write really simple Ruby and break it down into these small components that you can use again and again. And then when you render them, they kind of produce the HTML, which is the code that eventually goes to the front end. So this is the library that I spent 7 months working on pretty much full time.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
No, it makes perfect. So instead of having to, say for example, you had 10 articles.
Yeah.
Or, you wanted 4 blocks of articles. You don't have to put the code in for each block of article. You just say, actually, I want something here that is an article block. And then that comes. Yeah.
Your article, your list might be something like articles.each do, and then you pick up article. Mm-hmm. So within an each block, you might, if you're iterating over a list of articles, plural, then within that block, you've got a single article that you can reach for. And then you just say, like, render article view, and you pass in the article, right? And your article view is a completely separate file that defines the class of article view to take an article and then render out specific parts of that article. And you kind of just completely break it down into these small, reusable components.
So I take it, that means, let's say, for example, obviously CSS controls the styling, but let's say that the site owner says, actually, you know what, for all our articles across the entire site, we now no longer want Twitter links because Elon Musk sucks.
Right.
You can pull the Twitter links out of an article out of article block, and it will affect everything because you're never hard coding.
Yeah. You're not copying and pasting the same component implementation. You're just copying and pasting maybe a line of code that says render this component with these parameters. And so, you can do big changes across your entire site just by changing one file.
Which massively improves
like developer productivity.
Right, exactly. It's very, very cool. So this is Flex. Now, the key part here... go on.
The other thing is, because it's entirely Ruby, you actually are also not dealing with a file that has 3 programming languages in it, or like 3 languages in it, right? So an ERB file has Ruby in it. It also has HTML in it. It might have CSS in it. Or sometimes you have CSS embedded directly into HTML.
Okay.
It might have some JavaScript in it, embedded into the HTML as well.
Right.
But it will definitely also have ERB, which is this special language that allows you to switch between Ruby and HTML.
Okay, right.
And so you have one file, and your brain just has to like keep trying to switch between different languages. And in Flex, instead of writing HTML, you write Ruby, but the Ruby is like kind of connected to HTML. So for every type of HTML element that you can create, so things like headings, lists, list items, A tags, which are links, for every one of those things, there is a Ruby method that generates one of those things.
I see.
Then in HTML, you can then set attributes on these elements. So you might have an attribute of like class or something on your heading. And in Ruby, you just pass that attribute through as an argument to the method call.
I see. Okay.
And so you're kind of writing like an HTML within Ruby, but using all of the native Ruby
So you're
concepts.
using Ruby elements to then, when it's parsed. So, I mean, and I'm sure this is not quite one for one, but similar to how when you write Markdown,
right,
it then gets processed
Yeah, really similar.
Okay.
Yeah, so you just use this special way of writing HTML in Ruby using normal Ruby. And yeah, it makes a ton of things a lot simpler once you learn. Like if you know Ruby already and you know HTML, so it's so easy to write HTML in Ruby, and you get to take advantage of things that you can do in Ruby that you could never do in HTML. Like one of the things you can do is you can select a whole chunk of code, and you can like copy it, delete it, type the name of a method that summarizes what that code did, and then you define a method and paste the code into that method. And then you've kind of like extracted this complexity into a named concept as a method. And in your original code, you just have the name. So you can take a complex bit of code, maybe it's like 10 lines long, and you can kind of summarize it into a very simple description. And then you can implement what that description relates to in a different part. So you get like the ability to have like a high level overview of like what's going on. And then you can drill into the details if and when you need to, without being, you're not always viewing it at like 500% zoom, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. So then this leads me on to a big question about open source, because we'll come to your other library as well, and I guess this over. In fact, actually, before we move on to the whole open source, because both are open source, what's the other one that you're working on at the moment? You've just started a new one, haven't you?
Yeah. So the other library is quite tricky to explain. So this is a lot more abstract. It's called Literal, and it's trying to bring a bunch of ideas that I've found in other programming languages and in other kind of ways of thinking about programming, like functional programming. It's trying to bring some of those ideas into Ruby, and putting a bit of a Ruby spin on them.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah. So we're talking about like abstract concepts. What an example of a concept in this library is a concept called a variant. A variant knows what it is, and it also knows what it might have been. So, for example, it might know that it's 1, but it knows that it could have been 1, 2, or 3.
Right.
And then when you want to use that variant somewhere, you can't just get its value, right? You've got this result object maybe, and it's a variant. You can't just say, like, give me the value of this object. You have to say, if this object is 1, then do this. If it's 2, then do that. And if it's 3, do the other. And it kind of forces you to handle this. And so it's that kind of like really abstract kind of concept that I'm trying to model.
That makes it. That makes a lot of sense. Now, both of these are, as we said, open source. Now, here's a question, and this is not a leading question. It is a sort of a thought process. You could have said, actually, I've spent 7 months more on these libraries. I want people to pay me for my hard work. I want to license. Yeah, I probably
should have said that.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm sure your partner's thinking, Joe, we could have been living in a bigger house by now. But that's kind of that's closed source, where you would sell a license saying, yes, you can use this library in your code. You pay me X thousand a year to use this library. But you've chosen to go down the open source route. Now, first question is, why? Why for you is open sourcing is so important? What do you see as the value to open? Because there's so much. I mean, as we record this right now, the dust is still settling of Red Hat's latest shenanigans with the licensing. But for you, why is open source so important?
I think partly because I depend on a lot of open source stuff from other people. It's nice to be able to give back and contribute something back to the community, and it makes it accessible for everyone. Like, the thing is, like, if everything is closed source, you can't get experience doing anything unless you are working for a company that has bought a license for that thing. So it's really tricky. I don't know if you could easily replace open source software with closed source software. Yeah, it does have challenge. I think that there need to be better ways of getting funding for the open source maintenance that maintainers do, because it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad that you can't actually make it maintainable based on just people like companies that are using your software making donations.
Right.
Like people just don't do that.
It's not a thing, is it? No, I mean, that's not always the case, but certainly...
I accept donations for my open source work, and I get like $100-something a month.
Okay.
But that covers nothing. That covers 20 minutes of work. I don't know.
Yeah.
It barely covers the hosting costs of running the documentation websites. And it's just it's nothing compared to the amount of work that you put into it.
Because that's something that maybe people don't think about, is when you're doing an open source project, you've still got to document, you've still got to have a presence for it, and all the documentations. Now, obviously, I take it your projects are on GitHub.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, are you having to, and I hope you don't mind me asking, are you having to pay for the GitHub hosting for that?
No, they do all that for free.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. But obviously, if you want more, you want better documentation tools, you have to pay to host that. And hosting it's not cheap, depending on the loads. So, but you were telling me this morning when we, because just a little bit of behind the scenes, Joe will literally call me at 9 this morning. We've been trying to organize this podcast, for months?
Yeah.
Joe called me at 9 this morning and says, "Hey, do you want to record a podcast today?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So, but you were telling me one of the challenges at the moment is maybe some new EU law that would make you, as the project owner who's accepting even the smallest donation, liable for security patches and vulnerability fixes. Now, there's two sides to that, right? That's good for projects in general. The accountability for fixing the code, because people who've been in the development world will know the issues we have with. Now, I don't know, was Log4j open source?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. Either. I need to find. Yeah. But we had the huge vulnerability in Log4j, and that was used in so much.
Yeah, it's tricky because on the one hand, it's kind of good to regulate, commercial software to be, have some expectation that it's going to be patched. But then if you define commercial software to include open source maintainers getting $100 a month in donations to barely keep the lights on, I would just turn my donations off.
And just fund it?
Me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It wouldn't be worth it.
Because you then have a liability.
Yeah, it is all entirely volunteer based. I don't feel that I have to do this, and I am getting benefits from it. Right, writing open source software, sharing open source software, means that you get to talk to lots of people.
Yeah,
you get a lot more attention. You have a great piece of portfolio that you can use to hopefully land better jobs, that kind of thing. And it's also just really fun. So that's why I do it. I wish I could spend more time working on open source stuff, but yeah, unless people are going to pay for it, it's just not going to happen.
And again, you've got and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, you as singular entity, human being Joel Drapper, doing an open source project, very different to the likes of, and I'm going to use Nextcloud, I'm going to use Netgate, who maintain pfSense, as examples. They have whole teams of paid staff. Even though it's open source, these are paid staff members, paid developers working on their open source projects.
Yeah, and you could say, well, then they should be liable for patches and stuff like that. But if you're not careful, they could end up just not contributing to open source,
right?
And that would be way worse. It would be way worse than having them contribute to open source, but you use it at your own risk. Honestly, I think that there just needs to, going back to this regulation, there needs to be a way around that. It's if you're using this under a license that says use it at your own risk, there are no guarantees to then that shouldn't be applied.
No. Now, of course, we're not, just to be clear, we are not saying that it's okay to not patch vulnerabilities in your code.
Yeah.
We're just saying that maybe it shouldn't be as heavily regulated when it's going to affect individuals who are maybe getting, as like Joel, only $100 a month. That doesn't cover your time. And I hope you don't mind, again, your primary source of income is your paid contractual work, right?
Right. Yeah. But I wouldn't say my primary piece of value created. Like, I create a lot of value at the job that I work, but I think I create more value in the open source that I do. And, because it's affecting everyone that uses this software in all of the companies that they work for. So I definitely am creating more value in that kind of work. It's just somehow there doesn't seem to be a way for that to kind of follow through and actually mean that you can get paid to do that, which kind of sucks.
So, I mean, you talk about value for yourself, Joe, and, your current role, they found you through your open source, through Flex, right?
Yeah, like I said, it's a great way to kind of get your name in front of people. But it's all very indirect. So,
Joel, look, this has been a really interesting discussion. I think open source tools and open source frameworks like Flex are wonderful. I think it should absolutely continue. And I guess if people do build stuff and feel that it would be valuable, would you encourage them to open source their work if they can?
Yeah, I mean, if you're building something to use yourself anyway, you may as well make it open and let other people contribute to it. Like...
because, final question for you, because obviously with it being open source, that means people can make contributions and pull requests to have their code merged into yours.
Right.
Do you get active contributions into Flex?
Yeah, ton of stuff.
Okay.
There are loads of people. I think over 20 people have contributed. I think it's probably even more than that.
That's brilliant. Joel, I always enjoy our chats when we're not podcasting, but this has been particularly enjoyable. And I really hope people have found some value in our discussions and some encouragement. Go and, if you want to get into coding, go and check out the resources we've put there. Joel, you've got a website, a newsletter thingy, haven't you? That's,
yeah.
Do you want to tell people where they can find more of your sound wisdom?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Mastodon. I'm Joel Drapper at ruby.social. You can also check out my newsletter, which is at namingthings.org. And if you're interested in the Ruby podcast, that's rooftopruby.com, I think. We always ask this question now. Are you completely off Twitter now? Are you done? Pretty much, yeah. I still use it to reply to people every so often.
Right. But it's not an active, I'm
not actively posting.
So bad. So folks, please do drop us comments on the post. Come and join our Discord. I think we've got a development. I think we've got at least a web development one. We've got a web development channel in the Discord now. I'll put another one for coding as well. Come and join discussions in there. We'll make it a forum style post.
I'll join the Discord and spend a bit of time in there this week.
That'd be awesome.
Or the week after we publish this.
Yeah, but for you listening, that means the week after this comes out. For us, it's probably going to be a couple of weeks because, schedules and stuff. But yeah, come and join me Discord. Drop us an email, podcast@crosswires.net. And any questions you have. Joel, if people send in questions, you're happy for them to be forwarded over?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. Joel, thank you so much for your time, as always. Folks, we'll roll the outro. Thanks for listening to this episode of Crosswires. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please drop us a note over to podcast@crosswires.net.
You can also drop us a comment on the post, or if you're a GoodPod user, why not start a discussion there too?
You can also join our new Discord server at crosswires.net/Discord. We've got forum channels for each episode and we'd love you to join the discussion there.
You can also follow us on Mastodon at crosswires@mastodon.social.
And of course, you can find the show in all the good podcast apps and all the really bad ones too.
More of our content, head on over to crosswires.net/YouTube for all our videos, and keep an eye on our Twitch channel at crosswires.net/live for our upcoming streams.
If you like what you heard, please do drop a review in your podcast directory of choice. It really does help spread the word about the show.
And of course, if you can spare even the smallest amount of financial support, we'd be incredibly grateful. You can support us at ko-fi.com ko-fi.com/crosswires. That is ko-fi.com/crosswires.
Until next time, thanks for listening.